A very, very good idea. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day 3 of the 9th weekend. Has anybody got a hangover?
Darren does.
Darren does. I wonder why, Darren. Every year, my wife tells me on Saturday night that I should go to bed early. And every year, John McGowan and Darren and bully me into sitting up. And at 4:30 this morning, David, everybody knows who David is, Tully, they don't know you. Wave to the boys and girls, Tully. Darren, John McGowan and I were sitting in my kitchen. Oh God, Matthew was as well. It was absolutely ridiculous. We got stuff up drinking gin and put it in the world's rights. But it's a Sunday morning, I think the world's a pretty rough day after all. So, in order to introduce our first speaker, he sings a song, he sings a song, he tells a good tale, he jumps naked out of a cake. It's Richard.
Hello, we're particularly privileged today to have a fine young academic with us, and I'm glad to say he's written a book for the CFZ, which we're all very proud of and very pleased that he's chosen us as, his vehicle to publish this very important book. I've got a copy of the book here with me. Here it is. It's the Girls' Book of Ballet. He's written a book for girls on ballet. Oh, la-di-da, the Girls' Book of Ballet. Woo! And he's here to talk about girls' ballet, which is for girls and they wear pink dresses. Ooh!
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. My name is Michael Woodley, as is evident from the slide, and I'm here to talk about something a little bit technical. I'm going to try and talk about it in a way which no one here feels let down by the jargon. I've been told to tone that down. I'm actually going to talk about these things, classificational typologies, because a variety of attempts have been made over the years to fit certain categories into some kind of classification scheme, by which I mean they're grouped in terms of certain traits that sightings are deemed to have in common, and then arranged based on the ways in which these resultant classifications are seen to correlate with known species, so sort of affinities, I suppose you'd call it. And I'm going to review Bernard Heuvelmans' model in particular, because that's actually the thesis of the book. Let's hope this works. Okay, so this is an overview of the presentation. I'm going to look at the historical efforts, and I'm going to move on to treating Heuvelmans' model on an identity theory by identity theory basis. And I'm going to move on to my proposed revisions of Heuvelmans' typologies, and then of course we're going to look at the future of these efforts and similar efforts in cryptozoology. Okay, we started with this interesting fellow, a guy called Samuel Constantin Rafinesque-Schmaltz, and he was a very brilliant but somewhat neurotic naturalist from the early part of the 19th century. And he's a very brilliant man, responsible for the classification of a good number of species, but one of the things he did was actually have a crack at sea serpents, and he, if you like, pioneered this idea of actually clustering sightings data into some kind of a taxonomy of identities. But the problem with Rafinesque-Schmaltz's model was he didn't really have very many sightings to back up his claims of sea serpent identities. So he developed what was essentially a 4-identity classification scheme, in which he basically divided sea serpents into one of 2 classes. There were sea snakes, which he allied with the sea snake genus Pelamis, and he also had these octopus, this genus Octopus, which was actually a genus of large eel of Synbranchiad. And but most of these sightings, it must be remembered, were not actually based, as I say, on huge numbers. Most of these identity classes were not actually based on huge numbers of sightings. They actually were based on sort of as little as one sighting from one person in the middle of the Atlantic. And as we can see, he developed this rather elaborate schema with some rather curiously exact measurements for length. For example, octopus bicolor here, which he assigned for length of 58 feet, and that incidentally I think was based on a single sighting or something like that. So he had a good crack at it. He sort of came up with an interesting way of rationally classifying the data, I suppose. But the problem was, as I say, the model really lacked the data. It was sort of preconceived in the extreme. Anyway, now we move on to a guy called Anthony Cornelis Heuvelmans, who was sort of the precursor to Heuvelmans, because this guy, at the end of the 19th century, he wrote a book. It was a book called The Great Sea Serpent, and this book didn't really cause that much of a stir in zoological circles at the time. It was treated, I think it was described as being treated respectfully, but not necessarily with any great enthusiasm. And he proposed this very curious thing. He essentially clumped all of the pre-existing identity theories, which were Raffenegger-Schmalz identity theories, into this one identity. And he managed to obtain huge amounts of sightings data from just exhaustive analysis of the archives. And he devised this thing which he called Magobius. Well, he didn't actually call it that initially. He actually called it Zeuglodon Plesiosauroides. And this was published in an article back in 1881 in the Dutch equivalent of Nature, which was called Natuur or something like that. And what happened was he basically changed his mind and decided that instead of this thing being a bacillosaur, this thing was actually this weird, sort of highly zoologically improbable amalgamation, chimera of many different affinities, including otters, and pinnipeds, and whales, and this, that, and the other. And it was a sort of this universal ancestor to all of it, or alleged to be a relic to this universal ancestor to all of these different things. And essentially, this Magobius, and as you might remember from the previous slide, with Raffenegger-Schmalz, he actually used the genus Magobius, which literally means big snake, by the way, to describe this thing, which was huge. It was about 200 foot long, had a big long neck, little nasal snorkels on it, and had a sort of huge, long, tapering tail. And the interesting thing is, he actually, in sort of classifying this thing, it's not a sort of formal classification or anything would be really acceptable today, but in classifying this thing, quotation marks, what he actually did was he made all of Raffenegger-Schmalz identity theories senior subjective synonyms, by which I mean sort of senior, previously proposed names for the same thing, which are not necessarily describing the same thing, but something like it, and subjective. And basically, now we move on to the man, Bernard Heuvelmans. He really needs no introduction. This guy developed probably the most comprehensive classification scheme to date. It was certainly the most heavily data-driven, arguably, actually. We'll look at that towards the end. But basically, he had over something like 600 sightings or something like that, and he actually whittled it down to some fraction of that, based on applying these sort of qualitative thresholds, quality control thresholds. We sort of eliminated sightings on the basis of various flaws associated with those sightings, like inconsistencies and things like that. And he also tended to eliminate sightings which were things which were one-off. For example, the trunco. I don't know if any of you heard of this thing that was alleged to be seen wrestling off the coast of Newfoundland with a bunch of whale orcas. He rejected that on the basis that it was sort of not something that was repeated, I guess, throughout the sightings records. And he developed this typological system, and they're all typological systems in the sense that they're sort of taking all the things that these different sightings clusters have in common and essentially deriving types, platonic types, I guess. And what he did was to develop these 10 discrete categories of which 2 he ended up dropping 2 and introducing this 1. So in the end, I lied, he ended up with 8 categories. But in practice, as I say, the two were dropped. The father of all the turtles, which was based on, I think, 1 or 2 sightings, and that was yellow belly, which, well, really, there wasn't a case for it at the time. There is no case for it now, and I think Heuvelmans realised that somewhere in the 80s. Okay, well, let's start looking at Heuvelmans' these identity typologies. Well, this beastie here, it's not necessarily a Loch Ness monster, although it's certainly been proposed as a culprit behind it, is the long-necked seal. It's a very, very large pinniped. It has, allegedly, and it has this extraordinarily long neck. It appears to have convergently evolved on the niches left vacant by the elasmosaurs. And the idea is that this thing has a cosmopolitan distribution because sightings, there are quite a lot of sightings. Actually, Heuvelmans listed about 82 sightings in total, of which about 48 were considered certain. In other words, he thought of them as being absolutely indicative of there being something there. That's quite a lot, actually. And basically, this thing was meant to be behind all the lake monster sightings as well. It said it could transition between salt and freshwater environments. It was what's known as a halon. And the other thing was it was terrestrially mobile. It could actually move along the land, albeit in somewhat ungainly fashion. And on this basis, Heuvelmans suggested the thing was actually an otteroid, this sea lion. And he gave this thing some interesting characteristics. So the breathing snorkels, they're a sort of a relic from Aldermans. And yes, whiskers and a fused tail, pinniped tail. And now we move on to the merhorse. The merhorse, according to Heuvelmans, had a sort of slightly larger range of sizes. The range from about 15 to 100 feet in length, whereas the aforementioned Megalotauria, which was the sort of para-genus name Heuvelmans gave to these things, he was incidentally fully aware that these names were essentially nomina, nuda, by which I mean nomenclaturally non-available, not legitimate names zoologically. So he sort of claimed these things were para-taxa, taxa which were used to describe things which were essentially outside of the mainstream, sort of I suppose a counter tradition of taxonomy. But essentially, yes, he developed. We have here the merhorse, again, cosmopolitan distribution, and this was based on actually a larger pool of sightings. I think 71. There is, sorry, no, I got that wrong. Smaller pool of sightings. Oh dear, it's gone stuck. There we go. Of which about 37 were considered certain. And the interesting thing about this is, yes, he actually thought it was a pinniped, in the same vein as he thought the aforementioned long-necked seal was a pinniped. But he believed this one had abyssal adaptations. It was actually a rather interesting story about this thing's mane. You can see it on the back here, the slides. I apologise for not that good quality, but the mane on the back of this thing actually, it was claimed by Ivan Sanderson, somewhat, well, extremely improbably, that this mane was basically a respiratory organ, because there's a certain species of frog in the Amazon, I believe, which actually has these sort of fronds which are filled with a respiratory pigment, and they actually function as some kind of auxiliary respiration mechanism to increase the surface area for respiration. But the claim was that this thing exhibited a similar trait in this mane of it. It actually allowed it to dive for longer, although this is just zoologically, it's not possible. This trait has only been observed in reptiles, and it's highly unlikely to be found in mammals. There are various ways in which mammals can adjust the volume of their lungs to prolong dives, and rearrange their internal organs and things like that. So really, this is unnecessary speculation on the part of Ivan Sanderson. But still, it's an interesting anecdote nonetheless. But as I say, this thing was meant to look at great depth, so it had these big eyes, and it could see. It allegedly could see a considerable amount of. It could allegedly receive large amounts of light with depth. And it it was totally aquatic as well. If it was a pinniped, it was an extremely advanced one. It actually had no aquatic, so it had no amphibious characteristics. It was exclusively aquatic. But the other thing, moving swiftly on, was this many-humped sea serpent. And the many-humped sea serpent was essentially a species of whale. Heuvelmans believed it was a species of archaeocete. It's a very primitive form of whale, and this was the beastie behind the New England, the spate of sightings off the coast of New England, which took place throughout the 19th century. Actually, quite intriguing body of data. And one of the things that witnesses reported consistently were multiple humps in the water. And the interesting thing about this was that Heuvelmans sort of came up with this rather interesting identity, somewhat contrived identity for this thing, which suggested that these humps, and I think this might actually be another Ivan Sanderson suggestion. You'll find if you read In the Wake of Sea Serpents a lot of the things which Heuvelmans has given credit for, including actually the coining of the term cryptozoology, were in fact Ivan Sanderson's brainchild or suggestion. And as I say, this thing has these static humps arranged around its back, and Heuvelmans sort of thought they might be ballast organs, they might be inflatable sacks, or Sanderson actually thought they might be supplementary air reserves, so again allowing this thing to dive, somewhat improbable arrangement, but intriguing. The other thing that's interesting about this pinniped is, talking about this archaeocete, is this. You might think this is a flipper, well it's not actually, it's a dorsal fin. And Heuvelmans believed that these pinnipeds actually, the males exhibited dimorphism, and the large ones actually possessed dorsal fins, sort of a proto-cetacean trait. And they had again this characteristic median length neck and this sort of long body. And again, it was exclusively North Atlantic range, and a fairly good number of certain sightings associated with this. This was 33, and a sort of fairly decent number of sightings in total, which Heuvelmans did not rule out, sort of based on this qualitative control mechanism. Anyway, this is actually one of my favourites, the super otter, which Heuvelmans called Hydra Egedi. And he named it after Hans Egede. Hans Egede was a Norwegian, I think he was Norwegian. He was on his way to Greenland, the Bishop of Greenland, I think. And basically he observed this thing in the water. I haven't got a picture of it here, but it was this long, you probably will see it, the ship, and this long sort of tapering thing, these two little fins. And Charles Paxton's recently suggested that these might be whales in a state of arousal, and I mean, it's a plausible hypothesis. I've seen the pictures of these things, and yes, they do actually look remarkably similar, but there's still 13 serpent sightings, and it's doubtful as to whether they can all be explained by this, although no one's actually looked at all of the sightings that Heuvelmans considered to be reliable, and sort of applied this logic to it, applied this model to it, rather. But this thing was very strange. He believed it was a very primitive archaeocete. Whales started off as sort of very large and very amphibious otter-like creatures. And the interesting thing was, Heuvelmans got something spectacularly right and spectacularly wrong simultaneously with this cryptid. On the one hand, he suggested that it was actually, as I say, a primitive whale. And on that basis, he made all sorts of assessments as to whether it was aquatic and whether it wasn't aquatic. It actually makes up quite a sizable portion of the debate concerning this species. And he believes this thing lived on ice floes, essentially. It could sort of board ice like a raft and leave, somewhat similar to a polar bear. And the interesting thing was, we now know a lot more about the evolution of the whales than we did when Heuvelmans was writing. And we actually know that there were otter-like ancestors of modern whales, or species which were existing at about the same time as the ancestors of modern whales, and related species. But they weren't 100 feet long, they were sort of 6 feet long. So he got something both right and wrong with that. He also thought it might be a ceranian, i.e. a relative of the sea lions, the sea cows and the manatees. But that was just, if I'm wrong, then it's probably this type of speculation. Here is another one of my favourites, the many-finned sea serpent, which has been the subject of what I consider to be quite what I consider to be a red herring cryptozoologically, which has sort of persisted iteratively throughout the subsequent literature. But basically, yes, he thought of this thing as being an armoured archaeocete, this armoured whale, a fairly modern basilosaur, I guess. Primitive, obviously, but one which had this armour, and he believed the armour, and at the time actually it wasn't considered that implausible that archaeocetes could possess armour. As a matter of fact, there was some tentative evidence of this, dare I say tantalising evidence of this, in the form of shell fragments which were actually found in situ with the remains of fossilised basilosaurs, and it was believed these were osteoderms, so everyone got scratching their heads and thought, ah, well, maybe these things have evolved this armour as a response to predation from sharks. So, anyway, this thing had this equatorial to subtropical distribution, and again, it was based on a sort of fairly decent number of sightings that Heuvelmans would regard as being very, very certain. Anyway, this is the super eel, and the super eel was quite an enigmatic identity theory. It was actually based on Heuvelmans didn't really think there was one thing behind the super eel. He actually thought there could be a number of different things behind the super eel. He proposed synbranchids, he proposed elasmobranchs, that's sharks. He proposed regular eels, your morays and things like that, and oarfish, of course. And these eels actually have a sort of, you get two different types, it's sort of a bimodal distribution of sizes. You get on the one hand, you get these sort of ones which cluster around the 30 feet in length, and you get these ones which cluster around the 100 feet in length. And basically, this thing is found everywhere. It's sort of cosmopolitan, and it's based on it's not based on that many high-quality sightings. And you notice he uses the term high quality instead of certain. He did actually have this sort of qualitative scale of data for assessing good data, sort of fairly good data, and okay data and bad data. And this is partly on the basis that he rejected a lot of these sightings initially. So basically, now we move on to the giant invertebrates category. And the giant invertebrates category is a new addition to Heuvelmans' taxonomic schema. He proposed this, I think, in the 80s. I might be wrong, actually. I don't think anyone really knows when he actually started proposing this. I think it was in the 80s, probably in an article in Cryptozoology, a now defunct journal of the ISC. But he proposed that basically, he didn't really say much about them either. It might actually be a footnote somewhere as well, I'm not actually sure. But basically, what he suggested was that you get these things like giant salt colonies, which is Urocordax, and Venus's girdle, which are these sort of very impressive, translucent, eel-like creatures. You see here, this is a Venus's girdle. And his idea was that these things could grow very, very big, and that these things were actually partly responsible for sea serpent sightings. And because they were anomalous, i.e., they were reaching sizes not known to be previously attainable in these species, they therefore counted as cryptids. Now, there's a bit of point of ambiguity here, actually, because Heuvelmans never really specified whether these had to be new species, or whether they had to actually be just sort of giant forms of known species. I don't think Heuvelmans ever really actually made a distinction, to be honest. He came up with a sort of very weird definition of cryptozoology, which was based on this idea we should all be sort of, as cryptozoologists, making a profession out of seeking and specifically seeking fantastic animals. He actually uses the term fantastic, I believe. But really, that's not a very good definition of cryptozoology, despite the fact that it can essentially be described as its father. But anyway, as I say, there's some debate as to what these things might actually be and whether they qualify as cryptids, but we'll leave them in here as Heuvelmans actually included. But anyway, now the last category, not necessarily the last in terms of how Heuvelmans presented them, but the last here, are the marine saurians. The sort of black smudge is supposed to be a generic marine saurian. And Heuvelmans believed that these very, very large reptiles, sort of between 50 and 60 feet in length, which mostly came from the equatorial regions, but there's actually a couple of interesting sightings of these things from the North Sea and from areas of the ocean, which are aerial seas, which are fairly cold, and you wouldn't necessarily think of as being bad, hospitable to reptiles. Basically, yet again, very, very few sightings for these. Only 4 considerably of high quality. Again, no high quality, not certain. And he believed, and this is probably the wackiest, the reason I actually have it here is last is because it's really the wackiest identity theory that Heuvelmans came up with, really on no grounds whatsoever. He said, okay, these things have to be, relict Thalattosuchian crocodiles, or relic mosasaurs, or some other, pliosaurs, or relic sort of crocodiliform marine reptiles. And I think he mentioned specifically Thalattosuchians and mosasaurs. And I mean, he could have talked about these things being, some kind of new species of crocodile that's become exclusively aquatic, but no, he didn't. He insisted on dredging up the idea of prehistoric survivors. Anyway, now we move on to the, I suppose you'd call it the essence of the way in which I've attempted to treat Heuvelmans' identity theories and sort of assess their plausibility. I call it, originally enough, the plausibility method, drum roll. But basically, essentially, if you look at Heuvelmans' model as an algorithm, by which I mean a sort of a set of processes through which the data, a series of inputs and a series of outputs, and a process which allows you to get from one set of inputs to a particular set of outputs. Heuvelmans' model here is integrative. It's a sort of an integrating algorithm, because effectively what you do, the qualitative, not quantitative. But effectively what Heuvelmans did was he took a huge body of data, he explored analytical trends within that data, and he combined them, found these analytical correlates, and based his identity theories on these points of correlation. And what I've suggested is that really, that's not actually a really very good way of assessing, of deriving identity theories, because as Heuvelmans demonstrated, I think, with the mosasaur and with the relic Thalattosuchia, you really, if you have preconceptions about what these things are, it's very easy to sort of modify this process so that you're always going to get what you want out of it. And I think Heuvelmans sort of went in there thinking, I really want there to be mosasaurs, and I really want there to be relic Thalattosuchia. Wouldn't that be cool? So I'm going to take this tiny number of sightings, and I'm going to say that they're compatible with this identity theory. Anyway, what I've done is I've sort of come up with this new algorithm, I suppose you'd call it, for assessing the validity of these, actually assessing the validity of Heuvelmans' identity theories rather than the data. So I'm not actually dealing with the data. The data may be right or may be wrong. What I'm doing is essentially looking at the validity or plausibility of Heuvelmans' identity theories. And what I've suggested is essentially you don't need that much data really to derive a plausible identity theory. So we're going to be reasonable to Heuvelmans and say, well, we'll consider some of the smaller data pools, and we'll just evaluate the hypotheses. So I said, you can start off with your data here. Yes, you use intercorrelation. Intercorrelation is very important. That's how you identify your analytical trends. And what you do, it's sort of an open-ended thing. You pump new data into this thing. And what this effectively does is you then look at these extrinsic factors here. And you might not be able to agree, definitely won't be able to agree that. And they're basically hypothetical evolutionary narratives, ecological constraints, that kind of thing. And what the idea is that the data feed into these extrinsic factors, and what you get out of it is a putative identity. Now, the model is open-ended because as you add new data to the system, it's a qualitative algorithm. Heuvelmans was in no way quantitative, unfortunately. What you do is you get out of this sort of the capacity to either falsify or modify these putative identity theories on the basis of changes in the evidence. So it's a flexible way of assessing Heuvelmans' identity theories. And he really should have had something like this in mind instead of something like this, but anyway. I'm glad he didn't actually, because then I couldn't have written my book. Okay, so based on applying this model, I suppose, this algorithm, to these identity theories, we get some rather interesting stuff happening. Like, for example, here with the long-necked seal. And basically, I've done a few bits and pieces. For example, here, this graph here shows the frequency of catch size data for cod caught in the Atlantic. This is the average for all the species of cod in the Atlantic, and this is sort of to the present day, well actually it's to the year 2000, from sort of 1920 or something like 1930. And what I've done here is I've actually looked at the visual correlation between that and the sightings data for Heuvelmans for the long-necked seal. This is for certain sightings data, not be uncertain, I'll actually only use certain here. And effectively what happened was, I got something rather interesting. I found that the stochasticity of this curve has a tendency for it to sort of jump up and down, you know, like a jiggly line of like to fluctuate. You found interesting points at which certain depressions in one data set corresponded with certain depressions in the other. Now, this is very anecdotal. It's not, you know, it's just an interesting way of trying to relate two variables. Because my theory here is that the long-necked seal, if it exists, is going to prey on something that sort of occupies a very similar niche to a prey item of the Elasmosaurus. I mean, Elasmosaurus preyed on an animal known as, well, they preyed on lots of things, but one animal they were known to prey on was something called Encodus. And it was a large predatory fish. It was also known as a saber-toothed herring by some paleontologists who observed this thing with rather interesting teeth. And it was about, it's a large thing, it could grow up to sort of about 1 metre or 2 in length actually. And there's one animal which is very similar ecologically to Encodus, which lives in today's oceans and actually occupies largely the same niche. And it's the cod, believe it or not. It's roughly the same size, it's very similar ecologically. So my theory was, long-necked seals being, you know, assuming that they're sort of convergent evolving on niche Elasmosaurus, going to go after something like Encodus. So I thought, well, cod. So why not look at the changes in catch size of cod and use this and look at this in the context of changes in sightings data. The interesting thing is this allows me to make certain predictions because basically here it stops. The reason it stops is Heuvelmans wasn't collecting data after after the second edition of the Way came out. He'd sort of gone up to 1968 or something like that. And he wasn't really collecting any data beyond that. And I don't think he ever kept records, but he might have done that, probably in some Swedish museum somewhere, I think. But then until he published records of sightings which would correspond with these various archetypes after that time. So I predict, based on this, if this trend is actually, and Heuvelmans, by the way, was predicting that the long-necked seals are increasing in number with every year, they're actually getting more numerous. If these trends actually could be extrapolated into the future, then my theory is that the number of sightings will drop drastically, and this is because the cod abundance data are actually showing this massive decline in cod stock reserves as a function of overfishing. So, as I say, assuming that predator-prey relationship, then if the food source of the long-necked seal is being impacted, then yes, there will be an impact on the number of sightings, using the number of sightings as a proxy for population size in the absence of any actual data on that, given that the thing has been undiscovered and may or may not actually exist. I think they've done a fairly good job there. But basically, this curious-looking graph here is actually a graph looking at what I consider to be possible inter-specific competition between two types of sea serpent: the merhorse and the long-necked seal, both of which are pinnipeds. And this is quite interesting because this is from North America. And North America, you see huge numbers of Megalotauria, the long-necked seal. Very, very few Halshippus, very few merhorse. And similarly here, this is off the coast of the UK actually, huge numbers of Megalotauria, this is off the western coast of America rather, huge numbers of, in California coast, Pacific coast rather, huge numbers of Halshippus sighted, and very, very few Megalotauria. So in theory, if these things are attempting to co-opt the same niches within these particular areas, then there's going to be competition which will reflect in quite radically different numbers of species, with quite radically different numbers of sightings as proxy for population size. That's of course assuming that they're attempting to co-opt the same niche, and I'm also assuming that something about the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, is more amenable to Halshippus. Perhaps there are more opportunities for it to take advantage of its abyssal adaptations and fewer opportunities for Megalotauria to take advantage of its adaptations, who knows? And likewise, the converse could be true in the case of North America. Anyway, here, these two are just some of what I consider to be more interesting evidence of the existence of a long-necked seal. There is, of course, a famous Lake Champlain photograph, which I know it's been suggested by skeptic Benjamin Radford, who's a fascinating guy. Very interesting size analysis. He's reassessed Leblanc's estimate of the size of this thing. So Leblanc looked at this photograph. He said, based on the height of these waves, this thing was probably about 50 feet long. And Radford said, well, no, actually, based on the fact I've gone out and replicated it using a model, this thing's probably only about 15 feet long. Still, it's intriguing, still pretty big. Whatever Sandramancy saw that fateful day, a fateful summer day off the Lake Champlain in 1977, it was fairly large. Now, Radford happens to think this is a tree stump, basically buoyed up to the surface by methanogenic bacteria. So, the bacteria, they break down the cellulose and the biochemicals in the tree, and they release methane, and this methane causes the tree stump to buoy up to the surface. And of course, there's he points to the fact there's what he considers to be a little raise here, which he thinks is basically a part of the stump surfacing. Now, it might very well be a tree stump, but one or two things have always made me sceptical about the hypothesis, and one of them is that the head. The head was described as being independently animate from the body. The head was described as moving like that. And unless the tree stump was disintegrating at the surface in a very, very interesting and convenient way to make it look like this rotating head, swiveling neck, then I'm actually sceptical of the skeptical explanation of this, and I'm toying with the idea that this might be a long neck of some sort that's accessed Lake Champlain somehow. But the most interesting and compelling data for this actually come from the so-called Macintosh Bell encounter. How many of you have heard of Macintosh Bell's somewhat interesting report of a sea serpent, which he observed off the coast of the Orkney Islands. Hoy was the name of the locale. He was taken out fishing one day by some fishermen who told him a fish story. They said, there's this weird thing in the sea, and basically we want you to come and have a look at it, because you're kind of an amateur naturalist. So he went, okay, got on the boat. I know I sure as hell wouldn't. There's the slightest chance of something like that out there. I think they want to keep on the shore with a very powerful telescopic lens and say, well, you can go out and be the bait, But basically, he got on the boat and went out into the bay, and sure enough, this thing, which looked like this, he sketched it, was very shy, keeping a distance from the boat, but fairly curious, playful, swimming around, diving, ducking, undulating, etc. And the water was quite clear, so you could actually see it underwater and go on, moving under the boat. And this, I think, is the smoking gun for the existence of this cryptid, because basically we're describing something here that is essentially the archetype of the archetype. It's really the most long-necked seal that's ever actually been observed, because he described distinctly pinniped features in terms of its spatial structure, in addition to which it has this pinniped-like tail, which is sketched here, and this long neck. The thing, by the way, was about 15 feet in length. That's a tiddler. The idea is that they can get to 60 feet in length, and probably a juvenile if these size ranges are actually accurate, and still too big for me. But basically, the thing was, as I say, was seen actually repeatedly over the course of many summers, which is quite interesting, and an unfortunate, possibly convenient excuse, if we want to look into the possibility of this being a fabulation, was that Macintosh Bell actually had a camera with him, and he claimed that the shutter had swollen as a result of sea salt, ozone corrosion or something in the sea air, and as a result of that, he couldn't take a photograph, which was convenient. But then again, these old cameras did actually follow this up. I asked an old camera expert if these cameras do swell up, and if they do, and apparently they do. The particular type of camera he used was in fact notoriously unreliable in and around the sea. So it's quite an interesting bit of anecdote to really back the story up that there was probably a genuine mechanical failure with this camera. Hence we only have this very intriguing sketch, which I consider this encounter to be the smoking gun for this cryptid, the definitive proof. Well, not definitive. Definitive would be a dead one sitting here, preferably, would be sort of poking it with a stick and saying this, this. But no, unfortunately, in the absence of that, we have this, unfortunately. So as I say, this is the best we have so far. Now we move on to the merhorse, and the merhorse is a particularly interesting cryptid. Many people have sort of over the years given various para-scientific names to this thing, starting with Rappanesque schmaltz, who I think thought it was this Octopus bicolor, this sort of symbranchid thing, eel with this horse-like head. And of course these horse-headed cryptids have actually been described for many years, many centuries actually. And one of the earliest descriptions was Olaus Magnus, I hope I pronounced that right, or Oli Magni, Latinise it or not. But basically, he described this rather intriguingly large thing. It was notoriously aggressive and big. It lived in caves on the coast of Greenland, Denmark, and sort of the northern countries, and was notorious for attacking boats, downing and eating their sailors. Apparently had somewhat of a sailor was somewhat of something it didn't seem to like eating quite a lot. But basically, a couple of things which have been reported consistently with this cryptid that are very curious. Like it's always described as having red eyes. It's always described as having red eyes. And these red eyes are sort of a consistent trait associated with sightings. And of course, there have been a variety of speculations. The blog of Rosefield suggested that the thing was actually a plesiosaur, which I don't think is, if they had any idea, if they thought this through, maybe they wouldn't have come to that conclusion. I'm very sceptical of that. And similarly, there's a guy called Sagasti who has suggested the Serenian identity. This is actually his picture, his putative reconstruction of the skull. He seems to think it has morphological similarities to Serenian skulls. But Heuvelmans thought it was a pinniped. I think if it exists, it's probably a very highly adapted pinniped with an unusual fineness ratio. Well, this sort of ratio of body length to body width. Anyway, here we have the super otter and the many humped sea serpents, which are sort of lumped into one category. My pet theory is that these things are actually large otters, very large otters, which are sort of one stage up from an evolutionary perspective from the otters of the sea otters. They're sort of exclusively aquatic instead of being partially aquatic. And these things are very large. And Heuvelmans noted something quite interesting, which I've actually plotted here on the graph. Heuvelmans noted that the rise of the long-necked seals actually, he believed, caused the extinction of super otters through a process called competitive exclusion, which is where a more ecologically fit species attempts to co-opt and succeeds in co-opting the niche of a less ecologically fit species, who believes actually that these are extinct now. This is the many-finned sea serpent, as I say, one of my favourites. And the many-finned sea serpent is quite intriguing. As I say, I believe Heuvelmans actually took us down a blind alley as far as proposing an identity. This thing said it was a cetacean of armour. I say that's rubbish, mainly because of the description of this here, which is a description by a guy called Tran Van Con, who at a Vietnamese beach described one of these huge carcasses beached, and it rang when he knocked the carapace of this thing. It rang like metal. And it had these, like a bell, and it had these little protrusions, which were independently mobile, like flappers on the side, flippers. And what I've suggested is that this thing is almost certainly a crustacean. Actually, it's not an original idea, it's Carl Schluter's idea, but I've sort of gone a little bit further, and I said, well, maybe it's a crustacean like myriapod. And funnily enough, a myriapod and a crustacea do actually share sort of fairly commonalities, and are definitely related to a common ancestor. And there was one species which lived many tens of millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, called Arthropleura, that during the early Carboniferous was actually driven into extinction due to Permian era, Permian extinction, which was caused by desertification, climate change event of some sort. Nobody really knows exactly what caused it. But my theory is that the thing actually took to the ocean, and it evolved perhaps into this aquatic pinniped. Anyway, super eels, I'll go very quickly now. The super eels are quite interesting. I think they're nearly all fish. There's anything to them at all. And there might be sort of maybe an elasmobranch out there, which is pretty big, like a sort of a new species of frilled shark, which hasn't been observed before, which is perhaps exceedingly large and eel-like. I don't really think much of this idea that they're giant but they're giant symbranchids, and I don't really think much about it. They're giant eels, well that's slightly more plausible than giant symbranchids. Anyway, giant invertebrates, this is an interesting category because Heuvelmans actually, I believe that Heuvelmans was absolutely right. You can get theoretically huge strings of salp, which might be mistaken for sea serpents, while there are serpents to be salpa individual organisms. They form these colonial strings. And theoretically, anything that limits the size of a salp colony string are ecological shearing forces, ecological and mechanical forces, which inhibit the length which this colony can actually grow. So yes, that's plausible. Same with the large Nadiria. We know very little about the Nadiria actually. We know very little about them. Almost certainly some of the Nadiria, Venus's girdle, different phylum. We know very little about the full diversity of these things, and they could probably get a much larger range of morphologies than currently exist. And similarly, I believe this can be supplemented quite nicely with large examples of jellyfish, which Carl Schuker actually writes about in the Flying Toads book. Some quite interesting sightings, very large jellyfish, particularly the Arctic lion's mane. And Nemertea worms, of course, these large, very peculiar bootlace worms and their allies, which can grow to extraordinary lengths and have these little sort of rostrums, stingers and things like that. Curious. This actually is an interesting. This here is was a recording made in 2007 by someone called Jacob Garbosi on the Florida coast. And what it actually was something that scientists are not quite sure what it is. We know it's an Nemertea, we don't know what species, but it's pretty damn big. Most Nemertea are sort of very thin and bootlace like this. Has actually got quite a substantial dimension to it. So here we have a cryptid, right here, an example of Heuvelmans' giant invertebrates. And finally, we have the marine saurians, and I've toyed with the idea that these things are, if they exist, they're cetacea of some sort, which happen to look a lot like marine crocodiles. And we know that cetacea went through a stage where they had morphologies which were very crocodiliform. For example, in the case of Rhodocetus here, and Ambulocetus, which was an even earlier example of an archaeocete, which actually was an ambush predator. It actually had a crocodilian morphology. And of course, there are a number of species of whales yet to be discovered, and maybe vacillating, I guess, between whether or not I think archaeocetes still exist, but still, you can still have whales which have converged upon that morphology and are basically giving rise to this these giant saurian-type crocodile-like things. And as I say, the case for existence of this cryptid is generally weak, owing to the extreme paucity of the sightings data. It's very, very poor. And so you could almost be safe to completely discount this one. Anyway, conclusions. So there we go. Heuvelmans' cryptid identity typologies, they do need to be rationally revised and expanded. There's too many people taking this gospel, and they're not actually all that. The methodology which he employed in actually deriving these identity theories was intriguing, but there are ways you can handle the data that's far more rational, and there have been attempts made. So qualitative analysis, there have been attempts made at quantifying these, but again, it's very limited in terms of who's done what, and the size of the data that's actually been subjected to these kinds of rigorous analyses. So what needs to happen is you need more quantitative statistical analysis, as Charles Paxton first to tell you, you need to get math into cryptozoology. But qualitative analysis cannot be eliminated. Qualitative analysis is still a very valuable tool in cryptozoology, because cryptozoology is just that, it's a branch of zoology. Zoology is as much about the analytical side, the manipulation of statistics, as it is about the using qualitative methods to actually elucidate identities, describe these things. So there's definitely a room. You can't rule out qualitative analysis completely. It's still useful. If it's done rationally, then it's good. Future cryptid classification was mainly patterned on that proposed by Champagne in 2007. Bruce Champagne was most of you probably haven't heard of this guy, but I suggest you look up his stuff. It's a very interesting, very, very highly data-driven, auto-ecological sort of multi-factor method for inferring identity theories. And he takes these Heuvelmans identity theories as archetypes essentially, adds to it this massive volume of data, I think over 1,200 sightings in total, which he culls from a number of different sources. And then he actually sort of splits within Heuvelmans' identity theories in terms of refining from those identities which are more compatible with these autoecological correlates like salinity and wind speed and depth and pelagic productivity and this sorts of thing. Very interesting, actually. And it's really one step beyond what I've tried to do with Heuvelmans' model, and I think really any rational classification system needs to take these sorts of factors into account. So, there we go.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Now, as always, we are probably going to run late. At the moment, we're only running 30 seconds late. And I was really impressed that Michael, being such a meticulous analyst, he actually kept to his time within 30 seconds. The only person who has done so far this weekend. However, we have a couple of minutes, so are there any questions? Can I have a runner? Who have I got as a runner? It's Aurelia! Good-o.
First of all, Constantine Raffinesque Schmalz, is he the same Raffinesque who did the anthropological research among the Native Americans?
That rings a bell.
I think he was the one who produced the supposed history of the Delawares in a document called the Wallum Olam, carved on wood, and which has now turned out to be a complete forgery. So anything that he produces as evidence I would treat with a certain caution. But jumping on from that, Trunco, you said there was only one sighting. Now there was only one sighting of a Trunco off South Africa, and I seem to remember it came in with, it was washed ashore eventually, and there was no sign of a head, which will teach him to fight with whales. But there have been similar things that have been washed ashore on other coasts. One was washed ashore in Alaska, and there were a number of other things. So to say that Trunco is a one-off, I think it's perhaps a little, I mean, they may not have been the same thing as Trunco, but they bore distinct resemblances to the original description. Nobody uses the term Trunco for them, but they might well be the same thing. Hans Egede, or Egede, I'm not great on the Danish. How's your Danish? Yes, well, the thing is, you remember the thing about seeing the supposed sea serpent from a ship that might be a sort of Balina copulans. I'm going into a learned language now because there are ladies and children in the audience. But I understand he actually wasn't on the ship. He only had this by report. Now, most books will tell you he was out, and you know the picture that you get in all the books, the sea serpent rising up, and you get the impression Egede is somewhere on the ship, kind of looking up at him. But I believe that he didn't actually see the sea serpent at all. Some sort of jolly sailor of Danish origin told him about it. Have you come on that anywhere?
Well, yes, certainly. To address your issues in the order in which they were asked. First of all, with regards to the issue of Raffinesque Schmalz, Raffinesque Schmalz was a very brilliant naturalist. Some of his classifications, I believe, still exist today. Now, whether or not he was involved in this particular anthropological hoax, I do not know. And regarding, you might very well be right. You might have hoaxed that. But as regarding the sea serpent identity theories, the only thing I credit him with is thinking, okay, well, instead of putting these things together as you would a bestiary, just random, sort of anecdotal,
classification.
Exactly, what you actually want to do is create some kind of model for classifying the data. And I happen to think all of his proposed nomina and his proposed identity theories are bogus. I don't think they stand up to reason. In addition to which, the data are extremely poor, as I mentioned. Most of
yes, I realise that.
Observations. So it's important to remember I'm not crediting him with
that's
coming
right.
up with an insightful method for classifying, coming up with like definitive cryptid identities. So the second question regarding Trunco, yes. Now the thing about Trunco is that the problem is no one's really done the work on it. You say that there are these other carcasses which are ostensibly, I'm always very devious of carcasses and wash up on shore.
Luther's last book, published by us last year.
Okay, I stand corrected. I haven't seen this then, but I'm a bit
Well,
dubious.
go out and buy a copy with me.
Okay.
You're getting enormous amounts of royalties for this.
Will you stop interrupting? I'm trying to get illuminated here, and once he starts, I mean, he never stops.
Okay, I was saying about Trumpo. The thing about Trumpo is that well, it's dubious anatomically, but similarly it's...
well, having no head is certainly an anatomical deficiency.
But I mean, similarly, the idea of carcasses washing up on shore, I'm very dubious because nearly all the time, nearly every single time, except with the possible exception of a a Naden carcass rather. That was the thing that the LeBlanc and Bose will base a Cabrasaurus will see description on. With the possible exception of that, nearly every one of these things, these globs, have turned out to be, decaying remains of basking shark.
Basking sharks look like sea serpents very easily, yes. And just one other thing here. Did I understand you to say that Ivan Sanderson was actually the person who invented the word cryptozoology?
There is some debate about this. I understand that Lay, the author of exotic zoology, might actually have...
That's Billy Lay, yes.
Yeah. But the thing is, there is debate about this. And I think Heuvelmans credits Sanderson repeatedly. Actually, it's not a one-off thing. In a footnote, admittedly, but he does regularly credit Sanderson with this, although I think Lauren Coleman was actually the first to point this out. A lot of people just take it for granted the point was a kind of term. And I'm willing to go with Ivan Sanderson's, the idea that Ivan Sanderson proposed it. It doesn't really matter who proposed what, but the thing is, it's an interesting point, an interesting aside, it's sort of a tangent.
Well, that's interesting. Just one other thing. Your use of the term crocodiliform morphology. Now, when my wife is angry with me, she kind of assumes a crocodiliform morphology. Does that mean that there could be some sort of sea serpent blood in her ancestry?
If you get me the sightings data, then I can put them into my algorithm and I can tell you for sure.
I'll send you a photograph.
Yes, Dan, but Dan and Daniel blame the little Hibernian chappie next to you for keeping on a bit. You've got to keep it short because we don't want to run too long tonight.
Okay, in short, you're claiming that some of the sea serpent forms are either arthropods or vertebrates. I'm frankly very, very sceptical about that, because the average invertebrate doesn't have a good enough circulatory system to transport oxygen to the tissues. If it's relying on passive diffusion like a salp does, then you've only got a very thin layer of tissue that is directly receiving oxygen from the seawater, and the bigger it gets, the more of it is just going to be jelly, and the less of it is muscle. Similarly with arthropods, there's one major design flaw with an arthropod, which is to grow, it has to shed its skeleton, which means that at some point in its life, a very big arthropod is sitting there in the water column, completely defenceless. It can't even move because it hasn't got a hardened skeleton, and it's very, very easy to prey at that point. So I'm frankly very sceptical about that.
Okay, well, I mean, to address that, to be honest, I based my speculation, I admit it is speculation, although I'd like to qualify that by saying that speculation where we talk about plausible evolutionary narratives, although under normal circumstances we consider that hot reasoning, is marginally more scientific than what most cryptozoologists do, which is to enter something with certain preconceptions. But the thing is, basically, regarding this arthropod thing, I mean, I based the claim on this observation of an ecological trend called deep sea gigantism. And one of the interesting things is, Woodley's station was actually a marine variant of Woodley's called an isopod, and they grow up to about sort of 2 feet in length, which is, scaling. If you look at the ratio of scaling, it's quite an impressive. It's quite an impressive change in size. And by the reason why deep sea gigantism is driven by 2 things. Well, one thing causing another. First of all, basically the diminished access to food reserves causes delay in the onset of sexual maturity. And in invertebrates, mollusks and arthropods, this actually causes a massive, mega increase in size. So my theory was, if you started off with something like an Arthropleura, so it's a sort of large 6-foot-long myriapod that's already very aquatic and has just adapted to an exclusively aquatic lifestyle, and imagine what deep-sea gigantism would do to that. And with regards to the idea that the respiratory tissues are not adequate, that may very well be the case. To be honest, I haven't actually looked into that. That you might well have hit upon a debate before, and the answer is I'm quite willing to see that might be definitely that identity theory. But at the same time, there are a range of different ways in which arthropods acquire. They have a range of different pigments, a range of different mechanisms by which they take advantage of diffusion and various means of getting oxygen into the tissue. So I wouldn't rule out entirely the possibility of the evolution of novel systems for doing this in particularly large arthropods. And as for the idea that they can be predated, well, what better way to avoid being predated when you're shedding than to be, 60 feet in length?
Well, I don't think you can argue with that, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the first time we've had him here. This bloke phoned me up about 8 months ago and said, in a really timid little voice, "Hello, is that Mr. Downs?" He sounded about 12. He certainly didn't sound old enough to shave. "Mr. Downs, I've a book about what was it? I can't remember. About something. Long-necked seals." I said, "Look, I'm really, really sorry. We've just published one," which we had. I'm quite a nice person. I don't lie to 12-year-olds who aren't old enough to shave if they're not going me up and talk to them in a timid little voice. But it's quite an interesting novel look at the subject. Well, I tell you what, mate. Thinking he was 12, this was a school project. You've got a copy of In the Wake of the Sea Serpents. Go back and let's have a see. Let's see if we can have a new look at what these things might be. Then he sent it to me, and I thought, oh, bloody hell, I really have got it wrong this time. CFZ is always, the Weird Weekend has always been about introducing new people to the cryptozoological and Fortean circuit. And I've always tried to help people at the beginning of their Fortean writing careers. And I'm very, very pleased that this year we've got Rebecca and Ben, the photographer and the artist out there, and Michael, whose book is absolutely fantastic, whose talk blew me away. Michael Woodley.